We'll come to order, and our second panel of witnesses can be seated. And they consist of Mr. Eric Schaefer, the Executive Director for the Environmental Integrity Project, and Mr. Schaefer is also testifying on behalf of Earth Justice. As many of you know, Mr. Schaefer is the former head of EPA's Office of Civil Enforcement, and we look forward to your insights on this issue. He will be followed by Mr. John McManus. Mr. McManus is the Vice President for Environmental Services with American Electric Power. He is also testifying on behalf of Edison Electric Institute and the Utility Solid Waste Activities Group. Our third witness is Mr. David Goss, who is testifying on behalf of the American Coal Ash Association. And the final member of the second panel is Dr. Conrad Volsch from the University of Pittsburgh's Department of Environmental and Occupational Health. He's also director of Pitt's Center for Healthy Environments and Communities. Your full statements will be placed in the record, and we ask you to limit your testimony to about 5 minutes as a courtesy to others, and you can be sure that we will read them. Again, we will proceed in the order in which the witnesses are listed. And so, Mr. Schaefer, amen.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and Congressman Boozman, for the introduction and the chance to testify today. I want to follow up on a couple of points that were made in the earlier discussion. There was some back and forth about whether coal ash is hazardous, and I'll just make 2 points in response to that. One is the National Research Council in 2006, in their study of the placement of coal ash in abandoned mines, said very clearly that burning coal concentrates the toxic constituents that are in coal, like arsenic and selenium, many times over. Those toxic elements will leak out of coal ash if that ash is saturated, and especially when it's stored in wet environments. And that's from the National Research Council. The US EPA has lots of data which shows that the leachate, or the runoff from the coal ash, is quite toxic. It is full of metals that are known to be hazardous to human health and the environment. So whatever EPA decides to call coal ash at the end of the day, it sure acts like a hazardous waste, and I think we need to keep that reality in front of us. I wanted to talk briefly about how these dangerous pollutants can get into our waterways, thinking now about rivers and wetlands and creeks and bays. And there are 3 ways that we can have that pollution hit our freshwater and saltwater systems. One, of course, is that a dike or dam can break or give way. That's what happened in Kingston. And the committee's been very alert to that problem and asking great questions about it, and I know you'll continue to do that. The second problem, more insidious and I think more dangerous in the long term, is, as has been discussed, the toxic constituents, arsenic, cadmium, selenium, other metals, will leak out of the bottom of a landfill that's not properly lined or maintained. So just to make the point that it won't do you any good to keep building the walls up around these landfills if the pollutants that we care about keep leaking out through the bottom. And that is a problem. Once groundwater is contaminated, it can poison drinking wells, but it can also interact with wetlands and with creeks and rivers, and the contaminants can get into our water systems that way. A third problem, and one that may have received less attention, is the toxic pollutants can be discharged directly as the wastewater from ash pits and from scrubber sludge ponds is drawn off and discharged through pipes or ditches directly into wetlands or rivers. And I have a couple of charts at the back of the testimony that I'd just like to draw your attention to. We have, as the first example, selenium, which is highly toxic to fish and aquatic life. EPA has recommended that the level of selenium in freshwater not exceed 5 micrograms per liter. The standard or the criteria for saltwater is 71 micrograms per liter. And again, levels above that are thought to, in effect, poison fish and aquatic creatures and eventually get into bird life and potentially threaten humans. So the standard's very tough. As you can see from the chart, we have a number of coal plants that routinely discharge selenium, a very deadly toxic pollutant, at concentrations far above what EPA deems to be safe for fish and aquatic life. I just want to recognize that I'm talking about what comes out of the pipe. That's what's discharged. Once it hits the river or freshwater system, it may be diluted. And so, you are going to get some dilution, but these levels are so high that it's hard to believe that they're not going to have an impact, and in some cases, a dramatic impact. I mean, I just looked to the Tampa Bay example, Tampa Electric Big Bend plant. The discharges are at nearly 3,000 micrograms. You compare that to a saltwater standard of 71, and EPA needs to be asking what happens when that much of that kind of toxic metal hits the bay. Another example, arsenic. As I think everybody knows, we have a drinking water standard of 10 micrograms per liter for arsenic. EPA has recommended a much lower standard for rivers and streams that is designed to keep fish from being poisoned and therefore being made unsafe for humans to eat. That standard is actually less than a microgram per liter. Again, looking at the discharges from these plants, they are far above that level. Even recognizing there'll be some mixing and dilution, that is an awful lot of arsenic from these plants, sometimes going into wetlands or very small creeks, a big slug of toxic metals. Looking across the country, we found that almost none of these plants had limits. States do have authority to set limits on toxic metal discharges. Almost none of them have done so. Certainly that's not been the case at the TVA plants. Of the plants in the charts, we found only 2 that had actual limits, and those limits had been violated frequently in the last several years. So this is an emerging problem. I think it's worth emphasizing because we are pushing the power industry hard to install scrubbers and to clean up the waste that comes out of the smokestack. What we don't want to happen is for the toxic metals to get stripped out of the smokestack and end up in the water. We recognize that industry is installing these air pollution controls to comply with laws, and they're doing, in effect, what we've asked them to do. But what we're in danger of experiencing right now is pulling this stuff out of the air and putting it in the water, and that would not be a good outcome. This is a place where EPA should regulate. The agency's already promised to set standards for safe disposal. We think the agency also needs to regulate the discharges that occur from these plants as well. And thank you for giving me that time.
Thank you very much, Mr. McManus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to present this statement on behalf of American Electric Power, the Edison Electric Institute, and the Utility Solid Waste Activities Group. The electric utility industry remains committed to ensuring the integrity and safe operation of the landfills and impoundments in which we manage coal combustion byproducts, including coal ash. The accident that occurred at TVA is unacceptable, and as an industry, we need to do a better job of how we manage coal combustion byproducts. We have taken steps to ensure the safe management of CCBs, and we support efforts to enhance current requirements and oversight. In the wake of the spill, utility companies across the country, including AEP, re-examined their dam safety and inspection activities to ensure that these programs are up to date and functioning properly. A number of state regulatory agencies have also conducted additional inspections of utility impoundments to assess their structural soundness. And as we heard earlier, EPA has initiated a nationwide effort to assess the safety of coal combustion byproduct impoundments. We welcome this additional level of scrutiny. As you heard earlier, EPA intends to propose federal regulations for coal combustion byproduct disposal by the end of this year. The electric utility industry has worked in a constructive and cooperative manner with EPA and state regulatory agencies as they have evaluated regulatory options for CCBs, and we intend to continue that spirit of cooperation. It is important to remember that the issue of whether CCBs should be regulated as hazardous waste has been thoroughly evaluated and resolved. On 4 different occasions in its 1988 and 1999 reports to Congress, and in final regulatory determinations promulgated in August 1993 and May 2000, EPA concluded that CCBs do not warrant regulation as hazardous waste. In its most recent determination in 2000, EPA found that the RCRA Subtitle D, non-hazardous waste regulations, are the most appropriate mechanism for ensuring that CCB waste disposed of in landfills and surface impoundments are managed safely. We agree with EPA and support development of federal non-hazardous waste regulation under RCRA Subtitle D that would be implemented by the states. Such regulations would ensure that CCBs are managed in a manner that is protective of groundwater. We earlier heard Secretary Wilson express support for regulation of CCBs under Subtitle D. In fact, the states have consistently gone on record as opposing federal regulation of CCBs as hazardous waste, explaining that it is unnecessary and would effectively end the beneficial use of coal ash in many states. Our industry remains committed to continuing and expanding the array of beneficial uses of CCBs. In 2000, EPA concluded that hazardous waste regulation of CCBs would place a significant stigma on these wastes, the most important effect being that it would adversely impact beneficial use. The states and coal ash marketers and users agree that beneficial use would essentially come to an end if EPA were to regulate coal ash as hazardous. As one example of the value of beneficial use, in 2007, more than 13 million tons of fly ash was used to replace Portland cement, saving nearly 73 trillion BTUs of energy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 12.5 million metric tons. Our industry also remains committed to protecting the aquatic environment in the vicinity of our plants. All discharges from power plants to surface waters, such as lakes, streams, or rivers, are regulated through the Clean Water Act's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permitting program. Discharge permit limits are developed based on two separate groups of standards, effluent guidelines and water quality standards. Effluent guidelines are industry-specific limits based on available technologies. Water quality standards include federally established water quality criteria protecting human health and aquatic life. If there is a reasonable potential for a plant's discharge to exceed any water quality criterion, the regulator will set a limit for that criterion in the permit. Testimony received by this subcommittee has suggested that discharges of metals such as selenium and arsenic from coal ash impoundments are not protective of the environment. We do not believe this to be the case. The NPDES permitting program integrates the industry-specific technology-based effluent guideline limits and the water quality-based effluent limits into a well-established, effective permitting system which is protective of human health, fish, and wildlife. NPDES permits must be renewed every 5 years. At each 5-year interval, state regulators review new data on the facility, apply an established system of analysis to the data, and develop a new permit. This permit renewal cycle ensures that additional discharge requirements can be established as needed. EPA stated earlier that it is conducting a detailed study of the wastewater discharges of our industry as part of its regular review of all effluent guidelines. Our industry has actively assisted EPA with this study for more than 3 years, and we will continue to engage the agency on all aspects of this effort. In sum, the industry's goal is to manage coal ash safely with appropriate environmental protections and to use it in beneficial ways. We support the regulation of CCBs as non-hazardous waste as part of a federal CCB regulatory program under RCRA Subtitle D, as well as dam safety, inspection, and response planning requirements, which collectively will protect groundwater and surface water and ensure the structural integrity and safety of coal combustion byproduct impoundments. I thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to present the views of AEP and the industry today, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Goss.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, and distinguished panelists, we thank you for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Dave Goss. I'm the former executive director of the American Coal Ash Association. Our association promotes the recycling of coal combustion products, as we term those, which includes fly ash, bottom ash, boiler slag, and air emission control residuals, such as synthetic gypsum. It's our opinion that the EPA's regulatory determinations, both in 1993 and again in 2000, are still correct, and that CCPs do not need to be regulated as a hazardous waste. The recycling of these materials is really a tremendous success story. We've displaced over 120 million tons of greenhouse gases alone since the year 2000. During that same period, approximately 400 million tons of CCPs have been recycled into a variety of applications: road construction, architectural work, agriculture, mine reclamation, mineral fillers and paints and plastics, wallboard panel products, soil remediation, and many other uses that would have required other materials to be excavated or mined had these not been available. The use of CCPs goes back 40 years. In the last 3 decades, the EPA, other federal agencies, numerous universities, and private research institutes have extensively studied CCP impact in the environment. The Department of Energy and the Department of Agriculture have both funded, evaluated, and conducted certain mining and land test applications and studies using a variety of these materials. Consistently, these federal agencies found that when properly characterized, managed, and placed, CCPs do not have a harmful impact on the environment or on public health. The EPA reported to Congress in March of this year the results of data collected and analyzed by the agency from the TVA spill at the Kingston station. That data showed there were no exceedances in drinking water quality or air quality standards, and the information was based on hundreds of water samples and over 26,000 air samples. Furthermore, state departments of transportation using environmental and technical guidelines set by the American Society for Testing Materials, Federal Highway Administration, and the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials have used millions of tons of CCPs without incident or risk. The goal of this committee, I believe, should be in part to understand how the use of CCPs has had and can continue to have a positive impact on our nation's resource conservation goals. They have been and should remain a key part of resource conservation efforts because CCPs safely used in lieu of earth, clays, aggregates, or soils helps promote a zero waste goal. Fly ash, bottom ash, and synthetic gypsum are used to replace the production of Portland cement, which in turn reduces significant carbon dioxide emissions and similarly conserves other natural resources. There are national and international protocols that recognize the greenhouse gas reduction benefits of using these materials. When fly ash is used in concrete, it produces longer lasting, more durable structures and pavements. Nearly half the concrete in the United States placed incorporates fly ash because it makes concrete better. We, in fact, I believe we need congressional support to promote a green supply chain and further encourage higher replacement rates of fly ash and broader usage. Building longer-lasting concrete structures by using fly ash allows our country to move forward toward a greener and more sustainable economy. Less rebuilding in the future, lower life cycle costs, and fewer CO2 emissions. A key part of the strategy of recycling industrial materials must be to minimize their need for landfills or disposal facilities. By recycling fly ash and concrete, we bind the fly ash into a matrix, significantly eliminating the potential for any impact on water resources. Beneficial use regulations are crafted at the state level to promote recycling and accommodate local environmental conditions. The recycling of nearly 43% of the 130 million tons of CCPs produced annually is an excellent example of environmental stewardship and sustainability. Any effort by EPA or Congress to designate coal ash as hazardous, even if only for the purposes of disposal, could have a dramatic impact of eliminating nearly all these safe, beneficial uses. America would have to find environmentally safe disposal facilities for 130 million tons more of the CCPs produced annually. Producers and end users would no longer use CCPs because of the stigma that a hazardous designation would have. Recycling would end, in our opinion, due to the cradle-to-grave liability associated with a hazardous waste label. This nation should develop a culture where safe use and reuse of products and waste streams conserves our nation's resources. CCPs have played and should continue to play an important role in sustainability. Ample technical guidance is available to ensure the environment is protected while still recycling millions of tons of these resources. State-specific regulatory guidance will be best able to address local conditions. As part of the recent economic stimulus efforts supported by the President and Congress, green building has been highlighted. We believe that a key component is the creation of a green supply chain. Developing green jobs as part of the green supply chain and implementing projects that include safe recycling of CCPs should be a vital part of these projects. With an emerging focus on greenhouse gases, the recycling of CCPs contributes measurably to the reduction of CO2 and should therefore be encouraged more aggressively. We must better manage our scarce natural resources by using and recycling our existing industrial mineral resources, including CCPs. Thank you for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Conrad Bowles.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I am from Pittsburgh. the Smoky City. Just to let you all know that we can't even in our city monitor for and do high-tech experiments without putting millions of dollars into research laboratories to filter out all the fly ash that has been put into air over the last century of coal burning in Pittsburgh. You cannot drive in Pittsburgh 5 miles without driving past a coal ash pile, or driving over a mine fill that has coal ash. It is a very serious problem in our area. My research is focused on using fish and aquatic receptors as indicators of pollution sources and as sentinels for human health, and I'm funded by the Centers for Disease Control, the Environmental Public Health Tracking Network, to do this. My testimony today to you concerns known water quality impacts of coal combustion waste storage, including evidence that, number one, coal combustion waste mixtures have direct ecotoxicological effects on aquatic animals, without question. 2, trace toxic elements from coal combustion waste impoundments enter groundwater and are known to contaminate drinking water sources. 3, the predominant location of fly ash piles and coal combustion waste surface impoundments near large surface water drinking sources creates an unreasonable threat to public health and the environment, and that 4, the placement of fly ash piles and coal combustion waste impoundments constitutes a major environmental justice issue to communities across the United States. Table 1 in my written testimony lists 16 studies from the peer-reviewed academic literature that demonstrates that coal combustion waste has direct effects on aquatic animals. Many of these species are fellow vertebrate animals with similar hormone signaling systems to humans and are thus the canary in the coal mine for human health effects. Coal combustion waste effects in the southern toad have been extensively studied. Ash-exposed toads exhibited elevated levels of 11 metals, including a 47% increase for lead and over a 5,000% increase for arsenic. These studies suggest that coal combustion waste trace metals are associated with decreased respiratory quotients in these animals. And many of the metals in coal combustion waste are pulmonary toxicants, even if they're ingested in water, just as in humans. In a study that assessed concentrations of numerous metals in whole bodies of larval and adult life stages of toads after exposure to coal combustion waste, it was found that selenium and strontium concentrations remained elevated in later life stages. This study demonstrates that toads and frogs exposed to metals in fly ash ponds can move these trace metals to uncontaminated terrestrial and aquatic environments. In studies of the bird, the common grackle, feeding in coal combustion waste basins, and turtles raised in ash basins, selenium was found in significantly higher concentrations in ash basin eggs than in reference eggs. Selenium contamination represents one of the few clear cases where environmental pollution has led to devastation of wildlife populations directly from power plant coal fly ash receiving ponds. Elevated concentrations of selenium have degraded many freshwater ecosystems throughout the United States. It's also been observed that as much as 8% of total chromium is converted to chrome-6 during oxidative combustion of coal and remains in the resulting ash and is significantly mobile in water-based leaching. Thus, chrome-6, a known human carcinogen and pulmonary toxicant, can enter groundwater and can run off of coal combustion waste sites into tributary streams. There is no known safe level of exposure to chrome-6. Any increase in its concentration in water carries with it an increased risk of the development of cancer in humans. I'm going to end there, and please, I'd like to enter my complete testimony with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll begin our first round of questions. Mr. Schieffer, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. In your testimony, you note that we should not have to make a choice between cleaner air or dirtier water. Would you explain what you mean by that in more detail?
I'd be glad to, Madam Chairman. I keep doing that. I'd be glad to, Madam Chairman. The piles of ash and sludge that are generated by power plants are primarily driven by the fact that the companies have to remove air pollutants from the stack. And the Clean Air Act requires them to do so, and we recognize that. The problem is that the residue, the waste from that process, has been largely unregulated, and that's where the problem comes from. So we need to close the loop. We need to make sure that the waste that's generated from burning coal is properly regulated. EPA's promised to do that. We do think it should be regulated as the hazardous material it is when it is disposed of, and we think you can do that in a way that encourages recycling. And we think if you're going to discharge wastewater that comes off those processes, you ought to have to meet Clean Water Act limits for toxic metals, just as other industries have to do. So again, we understand the industry is complying with the Clean Air Act when they put the pollution controls in. That's good, but they create mountains of waste, 130 million tons a year now, and that amount is growing, and we need to make sure that that waste isn't creating another kind of problem.
In light of the information that's available, did EPA's enforcement program over the past 8 years fulfill its responsibility for enforcement with regard to the known and potential ash damage cases?
I came out of the enforcement program at EPA, so they're my colleagues. I think the program has come late to this issue, and I probably share responsibility for that. In the late 90s, we were very focused on getting scrubbers into large coal plants. We wanted that to happen because the air pollution can be very bad if you don't scrub the toxins out of the stack and if you don't take sulfur dioxide out of the stack. So I gave you the Big Bend plant in Tampa as an example of where lots of selenium appears now to be coming off the scrubber sludge and going into Tampa Bay. I was part of the discussions that led to the settlement, and we celebrated the fact that that plant was going to put in a scrubber because we knew it was going to clean up air pollution. Quite honestly, we did not focus on the other problem, which is the sludge coming off that process could eventually create a problem for water. So I'm not I don't want to be too hard on the enforcement program because they were very fixed on one set of problems. I think they've said they're looking hard at this issue now and they're willing to take some action.
You think they're overwhelmed with the responsibilities? And
I do. It's a big country, lots of sources. The people would be surprised to learn how thinly staffed enforcement is. I think the agency at one point, and I don't think it's changed, had about 30 staff nationwide to handle all wetland violations issues. We have a couple 100 million acres of wetlands, 30 people to patrol that. So they're understaffed and overwhelmed, and I think that's true of state agencies as well.
mm-hmm. One last question. Just as I was leaving, one of the people sitting out there indicated that they're interested in recycling this waste and making something positive out of it for a green project. Do you think that the reuse can be dealt with?
Sure, if the question's addressed to me as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think Mr. Goss has pointed out the benefits of responsible recycling of fly ash, the greenhouse gas reductions you can get. There are safe ways to recycle and reuse fly ash, and that's a very good thing. That is not inconsistent with regulating the disposal of ash as a hazardous waste. EPA makes those distinctions all the time. EPA has programs that recognize that disposal is a long-term problem. When you're handling hazardous waste, you need tight regulations, and then they create conditional exemptions for safe recycling. You can today take quite toxic waste, put it into a coal plant boiler, and burn it without that waste being considered hazardous, because it's recognized that when you do that, you're destroying the material. It's organic, you're eliminating it. So problem solved. There is a way to regulate disposal as hazardous and treat responsible recycling as basically exempt as long as certain rules and practices are followed. And EPA has a track record of doing that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boozman.
Mr. Schaefer and Dr. Voles, you presented some data, showing that there were areas in the country that are doing a poor job, evidently. And I think we'd all agree with that's inappropriate. I think, as Mr. Oberstar alluded to with the other panelists, we all agree that we have to ensure that this stuff is secured properly, however we secure that. You mentioned these areas that are doing a poor job. In your data, did you find any of the new units where you didn't see the increases that you're talking about?
We actually, to make sure I understand your question.
Did you measure any sites that you didn't see the extremely elevated areas like you're talking about in around coal-fired?
Our analysis didn't. Our analysis, the information we're presented to the committee, focuses on what's discharged from pipes or ditches at these plants. And in some cases, the processes leading to the discharge are relatively new. That's because the plant has only recently installed a scrubber. It turns out that scrubber sludge can be highly toxic, and the wastewater that comes off it can be pretty hot, and that's certainly true for a pollutant like selenium. So we didn't look at the age of the plant or the age of the...
I guess what I'm saying, though, is that in the plants you monitored,
Right.
you showed us the plants that were doing a poor job.
Right.
That you had increased levels. Did you find plants that were doing a good job where the levels much less elevated as opposed to the data that you presented?
We did. We found a handful of plants where the reported discharges are quite low. I don't think we can distinguish based on whether it's a new or old plant. It may have to do with the treatment process. The other thing I do have to point out is there's actually very little monitoring that's done. So the number of plants we were able to get the data for, and it all comes from EPA, was a pretty small universe. So plants that we didn't look at, weren't able to look at, could be doing significantly better. They could be doing much worse. We know some plants are trying to keep the waste on site and avoid discharging altogether. And if the waste can be safely managed on site and you're not putting the toxics into the stream or river, that's obviously a better thing.
How about you, Dr. Voles? Did you find plants that did not show, with the water that they were discharging, did not show the high levels that you're talking about?
I think I could generally say that the newer impoundments that are lined, we don't see the problem of groundwater intrusion that we're seeing in the unlined impoundments. That I can say for sure. There is a problem, though, and one of the major problems is, quite frankly, is this reliance that we have on coal. And burning huge quantities of coal, we don't know what to do with the waste anymore. We are overburdened with this waste. We are filling up ash piles at rates that are unsustainable, and even those that have liners, we can't keep up with the rise in the levels of these plants, so that we have runoff from them. So yes, the liners do help. They stop the downward hydrogeological movement of these metals. But we still are going to have a problem because the water is creeping up the hollows from Pennsylvania into West Virginia and into Ohio.
Did you, you mentioned the increased all stuff in the air. Does Pittsburgh, does it have a significant increase in cancer compared to the rest of the country?
Pittsburgh has some cancer rates that are high. The problems that are that we see in Pittsburgh are more related to problems of premature birth as well as low birth weight, and that is found in some of these areas. That they are environmental justice areas where there is coal-fired plant waste storage.
No, I agree. You know, we've got a problem. I think we'd all would agree that we've got to deal with the waste. I think you mentioned, Mr. Schaefer, you know, unintended consequences. And I would just, you know, I would encourage us to look at the plants that are doing a good job, you know, to focus not only on the ones that are doing the bad job, but to focus on the ones that are doing, and see what the difference is. And then the other thing is really think through the designation of this, you know, the hazardous waste, in the sense that we're not going to be done with coal tomorrow. I mean, no matter what we decide on, you know, it's going to be around, I think, for many, many years. And so as we do a better job of scrubbing and whatever, we're going to have even, you know, increased residue. So I appreciate your testimony, and yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hare.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. McManus, in your testimony, you state, and I'm quoting here, testimony received by this subcommittee has suggested that discharges of metals such as selenium and arsenic from coal ash impoundments are not protective of the environment. We do not believe this to be the case, end of quote. Does American Electric Power believe that the discharge of arsenic and selenium into the rivers is actually safe? And if you do, at what levels are the discharges of these two things, these two substances, not safe?
Excuse me. I believe that discharges at an appropriate level can be safe. Those levels can be established in the what's called the MPDES permit, the water discharge permit. Those permits are developed with the state regulatory agencies looking at circumstances around that individual facility, the water body that is being used to discharge into, the characteristics of that water body, the size of it. There's not necessarily a specific level that applies across the board, but through that permitting process, we can work with the agencies to establish that appropriate level and then manage our facilities to ensure that we stay within those levels. If that requires some additional treatment of that discharge, then we can put that in. As has been pointed out by Mr. Schaefer, we are installing a lot of scrubbers across the country these days. What we've seen at AEP is as we've designed those scrubbers and looked at how it changes the characteristics of the water discharge, we are putting on additional water treatment facilities so that we're dealing with this issue that was brought up of moving these materials from one medium to another medium to ensure that overall we're being protective of the environment, both from the air emissions and from the water discharge.
Is selenium and arsenic not permitted?
We have limits in some of our permits. We don't have limits in all of our permits. In some cases, we have monitoring requirements so that the agencies can see what those levels are and establish limits if they believe it's appropriate.
Well, just to be candid, I would tell you I don't know what the level would be, but I think selenium and arsenic in any type of measure into water would be a dangerous thing. And Dr. Volz, let me ask you, you described environmental justice impacts. I wonder, can you elaborate on what you mean by that, and what findings can you clearly, give us something on the findings you had from that?
Sure. We're a community-based participatory research outfit at the Center for Healthy Environments and Communities, and we work with communities that are affected by a number of pollution sources. And I will tell you that as communities around these large ash impoundments, the people there are not only exposed to or potentially exposed to groundwater sources, they're exposed to the air pollution also from the coal-powered plants that are very close. Oftentimes these are in industrial valleys where there's legacy pollution problems from steel mills that aren't there anymore. These areas actually people move away from if they can to more healthy and aesthetically pleasing areas, leaving essentially behind a tax base that's shattered both municipally and for school districts, with the resulting consequence, quite frankly, that the federal government and state government has to come in and fund these school districts and municipalities to keep them going, and this is a unrecognized subsidy to the coal-fired plant industry.
So I'm running out of time, but so I would, not to put words in your mouth, but I would, given the evidence and the harm from the coal combustion waste, I would assume that you would like to phase out the impoundments in favor of dry storage of the waste?
Well, I think we need to stop adding any additional waste to unlined impoundments. That needs to stop right away. We have to cover these impoundments because any air movement over the top of these the areas that dry entrains particles with up to 30% respirable dust in them, and people are inhaling this dust, and it's full of arsenic, chromium, lead, cadmium, and even radionuclides.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the distinguished chair of the full committee, Mr. Oberstar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Schaefer and Mr. Volz, what are the health consequences of ingesting selenium and arsenic at the levels shown in your charts on aquatic creatures, frogs, toads, fish, shellfish, and those at the top of the food chain, humans?
Well, we've done studies in the Allegheny River near Pittsburgh where we have some natural background levels of about 0.2 to 0.3 parts per billion of selenium. We find that there are ecotoxicological effects on freshwater mussels at only 3 to 5 times that level, meaning at about 1 part per billion. The problem with selenium is that it is highly bioaccumulative. It moves through the food chain, and top-level predators actually, just like mercury, bioconcentrated in their tissues. It is in a very complex cycle, cycling through the aquatic system, and we found concentration factors in the literature showing concentration in aquatic species of over 773 times in their tissue those concentrations found in water.
And what happens to, what is the health consequence to those?
They're many and varied.
Aquatic.
Many and varied. Freshwater mussels essentially develop gill filament problems. They're unable to breathe. Fish have endocrine systems much like our own. Selenium is known to cause jaw malformations and other problems in aquatic creatures, including fish, and especially even eggs, once they're laid, can accumulate selenium, or it can be transferred from the mother through the egg to the fish.
You know, I was interested in your comment about Pittsburgh in its current state. I remember Pittsburgh in 1955, summer of 1955. I was a student driving with some of my classmates to Quebec. I was going there had won a scholarship to study French at Laval University. We went through Gary and Hammond, and you couldn't see across the city. And I thought I had gone to heaven because this is where the iron ore went from the iron ore mining country that I grew up in. And this is what happens to it. Now it becomes steel. And you got to Pittsburgh, and your eyes by then that were smarting, and your skin was irritated, and I thought, oh, this is heaven. These are jobs here. But what a price we're paying. And then some years later, when I was administrative assistant, my predecessor, John Blotnick, his portrait is over there in the corner, there was a steelworker convention in Duluth. And a busload of steelworkers came to Hotel Duluth, and they unloaded. One of them rushed through the lobby to the payphone, called home. This was, of course, the days before cell phones. Got his wife on the phone. He said, honey, you can't believe this place. People breathe air they can't see. Those are the consequences of the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
And we're living with those now. And our challenge is to contain them. So on the one hand, as you've described, the air pollution controls on power plants removed toxic substances from the air and now put it in sludge that's on the ground. So it's very likely that the concrete blocks that I was working with, made of coal ash, were cleaner than concrete blocks made of coal ash today, because the selenium and the arsenic and the other toxic components were in the air at that time, and they landed someplace else.
I agree totally.
And they didn't go into the coal ash that was made into ready mix or concrete blocks. It's a curious, I hadn't thought about this until I saw this.
As we get more efficient with our air cleaning, we make fly ash more toxic.
Now, and Mr. Schieffer and Mr. Volz, Dr. Volz, what about the effect on groundwater? If these retention facilities do not have an impermeable layer, either of a mylar, very thick mylar plastic, or other material, or an extremely dense clay layer that is virtually impermeable, what is the likelihood of seepage into groundwater of these toxic materials?
It's actually highly likely. It's more likely the more literature you read, because particularly species of arsenic do not exist as metallic arsenic. They exist as oxyanionic species of arsenic in fresh water. And although the prevailing wisdom is that metals will not be mobile, when we increase pH, as we do in these fly ash pits, we have evidence that oxyanionic species of arsenic actually increase mobility through these matrices, because they actually compete with the hydroxide that's mixed in with the fly ash for binding sites. And we have evidence that it's going into groundwater, especially during summer months when we have particularly low levels of rain, and we have that part of surface water actually makes up more of the groundwater.
So if you have an acidic environment that is conducive to absorbing these oxyanionic materials, and making them available then to uptake and plant, and then you have a higher likelihood of a toxic effect on humans at the top of the food chain and other aquatic species.
Essentially, under conditions that we're seeing now, we think that there's quite a bit.
Do these facilities have monitoring wells at distances out from the containment facilities? Are there groundwater monitoring wells?
There are in some cases, but I believe that they're totally insufficient.
Okay. Yes.
Just to add one point, EPA has pretty extensive data that I think will answer your question, or at least help to answer it. For example, they have a risk assessment, very comprehensive, that estimates the chances of getting cancer if you are in an area around an unlined pit or pond that is used to store fly ash. And that's we think, a pretty conservative methodology that they've used. I'm sure they'll be glad to provide it to you and explain.
I will request that. Rainwater tends to be neutral or better, and in itself would not be conducive to freeing such materials for uptake, such metals for uptake. But there is acidity in the fly ash itself that would contribute to the acidification, right? To the absorbability of toxics. Is that correct?
Well, essentially, we still have a problem with acid rain in this country, not only from our own sources, but from foreign sources. And the problem is that that we also see mobility of metals, because these lagoons are not just being pumped full of fly ash, they're settling basins for essentially drainage of rain, and acids that go into them actually can help mobilize metals also.
Although, just one quick point, Mr. Chairman, the National Research Council 2006 study makes the point, I think EPA agrees, that acidity can drive the release of some metals. Others will be mobilized under more alkaline or neutral conditions. I think arsenic is one of those.
Arsenic is one of them.
Contaminants. So certainly the acid content of rain can make a dramatic difference, but there are other cases where even at neutral or alkaline levels, you can get release.
Thank you. It's very helpful to understand this in its total context. Mr. McManus, you said you would support regulation of coal combustion byproducts as non-hazardous waste. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What do you mean by regulation? What is your understanding of regulation?
Regulation under RCRA Subtitle D program, which is the program EPA talked about earlier, that they're planning to issue a proposal by the end of the year. So we're supportive of a regulatory program at the federal level, but as under Subtitle D as opposed to Subtitle C or hazardous waste.
Would you then, in that context, support a national standard for cold storage facility integrity?
That we see that as a separate but related issue, and we definitely see that there's some value in having either some type of federal standard or federal guidelines, because even in my company, we operate in a number of states, we see differences in how our states apply dam safety and structural integrity requirements. So we think we have good programs at our plants and in our states, but we see value in some type of a federal standard at a minimum, and that makes sense to us.
So I think I raised the question, I think there are two issues here at stake. There is the release of materials that are hazardous to health of humans and of aquatic vegetation and fauna, but there's also the hazardous effect of of a structural failure that sends a wall of water or ash material or anything else that wipes out homes and facilities and lives in the process. So whether we regulating the discharge for its health consequences is one issue, but regulating the structure, the containment structure, that is a kind of a different issue. And I think we need two elements here. You need liner materials or standards for liners in these retention basins so that toxic materials are not leaking into groundwater. We have such standards for solid waste facilities, landfills that are now being used all throughout the country, have been for many years, to produce methane, and they have very rigorous liner standard requirements. But we also need both standards for the retention facilities themselves and some frequency of inspection of the retention facility itself. Do you support the latter?
In terms of the inspection frequency, absolutely, and that is something that the industry is prepared to work with whatever the appropriate agency is, whether it's EPA or another agency, to come up with an appropriate standard. The effort that EPA has underway now that they talked about earlier, this information collection request, is a good first step in developing that information base on what's out there, what are the standards for inspection, what is done at the state level, and then use that to build an appropriate program.
What are the standards that you use, Mr. Goss? You're representing the Fly Ash Association. I didn't realize there was an association there's an association for everything in this country. Yes. Everyone has a right to be represented.
Yes, sir.
So even the lowly fly ash that need to be elevated to a standard of representation. Whose standards, that is, which agency standard or private engineering standards are used in the construction of these retention facilities, whether you call them levees or dams or just retention basins?
Well, sir, I'm probably not the right one to answer that question. We focus on the beneficial use, so the standards that would apply to the beneficial use I could answer. The disposal facilities, I'd have to defer to maybe one of the other panelists.
Mr. McManus?
At least speaking for AEP, we rely on initially guidelines that are developed by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, in terms of how you manage and how you determine the risk of an impoundment or a dam, and whether that's our fly ash impoundments or whether it's cooling water impoundments that we have at some plants, whether it's our hydroelectric dams. We use FEMA guidelines, or we may use FERC requirements as it relates to ensuring the structural integrity of those facilities.
I'm puzzled by that. I've been associated with FEMA, its oversight, its structure, its operation for probably 30 years. When it was Civil Defense Organization, I didn't know they promulgated standards for impoundments.
And this is an area that we'll check on and get accurate information.
See, it seemed to me that the Corps of Engineers would be the authoritative organization. Then there are civil engineering standards for dams, and there is a certain aspect, height to base ratio, and that has to be followed to assure the retention strength of the structure itself. And we're having those issues reviewed by the Corps of Engineers now for levees all along the Mississippi River. We're seeing vastly greater weather events, greater in intensity and volume of water discharge from storms, and the levees seem to be inadequate to stand up to those these increased weather events, increased intensity weather events. So it seemed to me that, that the integrity of these facilities needs to be revisited. I asked earlier the question, are these built up on a pancake basis, just straight up? And I didn't get an answer to that question. EPA doesn't know. When you increase the height, you also have to increase the base to improve the retention strength. You don't know the answer to those questions.
The earlier question about the pancake, I think, was specific to Kingston, and I'm not familiar with that.
Okay.
But we'll check on what kind of standards that we apply and make sure you have accurate information. And I may have misspoken. I think the FEMA guidelines are more in the determining what's considered a high hazard facility and
That would
what
be
kind
more
of
appropriate, yes.
what kind of emergency action plan requirement you may have in public response if you see an issue. So FEMA is probably more related to that aspect as opposed to the actual engineering standards of an impoundment.
Mr. Boozman, do you have any further questions?
The only thing I'd like to, you've been around a long time and helped write a lot of this stuff. Right now, and I think you described it very well, you know, we're talking about the integrity of the structure, making sure that it doesn't burst like it did, making sure it doesn't leach out, you know, with a liner or depending on the soil or however you determine those things. And then the other thing is ultimately some of that is actually discharged into the stream. And I guess I'm wondering that why through the permitting process that EPA doesn't already control that and why you have these very, very high standards. Now, we had testimony that they'd found situations, plants located around that actually had, you know, that was good water that was being, I guess what I don't understand and get a little frustrated with is why under the current Clean Water Act, why they can't enforce that through the permitting process to do away with the situation in Miami and some of these really.
It seems to me that EPA should have Clean Water Act discharge, pollutant discharge regulatory authority and to treat any discharge from such facilities as a point source. If they have a pipe discharging into a ditch, that would be regulated and that would be subject to existing EPA authority on the Clean Water National Pollution Discharge Permit Authority. We'll pursue that further with EPA. Mr. Hare, do you have any further questions? Anything that any of the witnesses want to add for the good of the order? Thank you very much for your contribution. There are a number of issues we'll have to pursue further. We want to assure the integrity of these impoundment structures, whether they're levees, dams, or just simple impoundments, both the structure itself and protecting its internal construct from leakage or seepage into groundwater. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Committee is adjourned.